Nova Scotia, Claudia Chender. The fall sitting is over of the legislature. What's your general vibe out of how that all went?
Well, another sitting has come and gone, and thanks for having me on today. And I think we didn't see much in terms of help for Nova Scotians as we move into the winter. You know, the two things we really hear the most about from our constituents and from people across the province are healthcare and the cost of living. And unfortunately, things are getting more expensive and healthcare is getting worse. So, you know, we put forward a lot of good ideas and we told the stories of the people who contacted us in the legislature. We talked about, you know, a man who laid in the park in Point Pleasant Park for 2.5 hours with a fractured hip waiting for an ambulance because there weren't enough paramedics. And we talked about Josh Crowley and his family. They, you know, working family who are not able to get any government assistance because they don't meet those thresholds, but they can't make ends meet. So we were looking for some action on that, but we didn't see any. What we did see, of course, which would be familiar to anyone paying attention, was a lot of dismantling of, you know, what we think is good governance. So dismantling of independent boards, dismantling of crown corporations, and really consolidating powers so that the premier, in his words, can push anyone out of the way who objects to their agenda. So we'll see if that bears fruit for them, but certainly it's not the position we would have chosen.
All right, what about on the legislation over Nova Scotia Power's rate and not being able to have the increases? Some people applaud it, other people feel as though that it will be problematic down the road. What's your take on that legislation?
Oh, you know, Todd, it's so tricky because there's no question that Nova Scotians can't afford a rate increase right now. And so it's really tricky to figure out what to do. And you and I have talked about power regulation. It's a complicated subject. But in general, people just don't have enough money to pay their power bills. So the government went in and capped rates at, you know, said that the UARB can't increase them by more than 1.8% and that amount has to be spent on reliability. And I think that sounds good to most people. The challenge is that it's in the middle of a regulatory hearing. So they didn't let that hearing finish. They, of course, could have taken legislative action before or after. But the bigger challenge, Todd, is that cap is exclusive of fuel costs. And anyone who drives in this province or who relies on fuel to run their business understands what we're paying right now at the pump. And that's still going to get passed on to us. So those bills are still going to go way up. And so, you know, I think there needed to be some action, but I think the interfering in the regulatory process in the middle is problematic. And even the consumer advocate, whose whole job is to make sure we don't pay more, is concerned about this and says rates might go up even further after these 2 years. And I don't know that people are still going to be able to pay their bills. So that's why we were advocating for things like a low-income heating program, or to increase the thresholds for things like the heating assistance rebate program and the seniors care grant so that more people are eligible, so that more people can use that money to make sure they can pay their bills.
All right. When asked about a break on sales tax, provincial sales tax on fuel, the finance minister, McMaster, says that even if he wanted to, he couldn't because Justin Trudeau has told him he's not allowed to. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, well, listen, that was such a curious exchange because what we've heard from the Progressive Conservatives this whole time is that there will not be a carbon tax and that they've submitted a plan to Ottawa and that we know it's not coming. And what the opposition has tried to point out to them is it's fine for them to be clear with Ottawa that they don't want a carbon tax. But if we look at every other province in the country, Conservative province that has taken that position, they all get a carbon tax imposed. And so what the finance minister said as we were pushing for them to use the windfall that they've gotten on this expensive gas, so they make, of course, the government collects more tax when we pay more for gas because that's taxed.
Yeah.
So we've been arguing for them to use that to help Nova Scotians. The finance minister said we're not allowed. Justin Trudeau told us a carbon tax is coming, and we're not allowed to offset that price at the pumps by reducing the gas tax. Now, number one, that's the first we've ever heard that the federal government told them a carbon tax was coming. Mm-hmm. They have been steadfast in their talking point that that's not true. So we now know that the reality is now revealed that we will be getting a carbon tax in January, which is unfortunate. There were lots of opportunities for a Made in Nova Scotia solution, I believe. But secondly, since when are the federal government listening to Ottawa?
Yeah.
It's a provincial tax.
Yeah.
He's in charge of it. It's provincial revenue. There are other provinces, notably Alberta, who have used the proceeds of that tax for different things. And we're not calling for them, by the way, to waive that tax. Mm-hmm. We're calling for them to use the proceeds of that tax to help the people who need it the most.
Yeah,
and that is certainly within his purview to do.
But it kind of works out for McMaster, because he can say, well, we won't take the tax away. They keep the revenue coming in, and he can blame Justin Trudeau. Right? It's kind of which is anyway. It is what it is. So I guess when all that's politics. That's right. So when all is said and done, I guess. What would you give the sitting if you had to give it a grade?
Well, it depends on what we're grading it on. If we're grading it on how much will it help the lives of Nova Scotians,
which should be that's the grade then. What do you give it then?
Okay, I give it like a D.
A D. Okay.
I give it a D, because most of the legislation that moved through consolidated power for the premier and his ministers and took us right back to the Buchanan era. So everything we understand about good governance and listening to experts and following science, all of that's been thrown out. I think they got rid of something like a dozen independent boards and commissions in this sitting and just before. And that's what they spent their time on. I mean, I think, to be fair, they would say, well, we are laying the ground for us to be able to make those changes. We absolutely disagree that this is the way to do that. And in the meantime, they squandered the opportunity to make a real difference in people's lives, to get themselves more power. And, I think it's unfortunate. I think we're heading into winter. Last night, most people had their heat on who have heat in their homes. And we still have massive questions about how people are going to make it through this winter. Housing continues to be a huge issue, and all we see is bigger giveaways to developers and, alienating municipalities across the province, which I don't think is going to help anybody's cause. And healthcare is getting worse. The situation in the ERs is terrifying. We want to see improvement on that. It's not a political thing. It's a human thing, a Scotian thing. We want those things to get better.
Right.
But we're not seeing it so far.
Claudia, appreciate your time. We'll talk soon.
Thanks so much, Todd.
All right, take care. Claudia Chender, leader of the NDP. We'll take a break.
It's the Todd Veinotte Show.